The Corporate Retreat. Part 1. A glance across the room. The private plane hummed softly, cutting through the clouds, as Emma adjusted her seatbelt and glanced at her phone one last time. Her husband, Mark, had sent a sweet message. "Hope the trip goes well. Can't wait to hear all about it when you're back. Love you." She smiled, feeling a mixture of excitement and guilt as she replied with a quick, "Love you too. Talk soon." Sitting just across from her was Adrian Cole, the CEO of the tech company where she had been climbing the ranks for the past 8 years. He was a man in his early 40s, commanding attention with his tall, broad-shouldered frame and calm, piercing gaze. His salt and pepper hair added to the allure of his powerful presence. Emma had worked with him closely for years, but this was the first time she would be spending extended, intimate time away from the office, away from prying eyes. The corporate retreat at a luxury hotel nestled in the mountains of Colorado was designed to recharge the company's executives. It was a high-stakes weekend, a make-or-break opportunity for her. Promotions would be discussed, future strategies mapped out. But none of that felt quite as intense as the sudden shift in the energy between her and Adrian over the last few weeks. Their interactions had always been professional, until recently. The occasional brush of his hand as he handed her papers, the lingering eye contact during meetings, the subtle way he complimented her after presentations. Something was simmering beneath the surface. And now, with the corporate retreat on the horizon, that tension hung between them, palpable and undeniable. The plane landed smoothly on the private airstrip, and Emma found herself stepping into the crisp mountain air with a flutter in her chest. She checked her reflection in the car's window, her sleek black hair pinned back in an elegant twist, her tailored suit hugging her figure in just the right way, professional yet undeniably feminine. Adrian, stepping out just behind her, offered a smile that made her stomach tighten. The hotel was a world unto itself, modern, luxurious, with walls of glass that overlooked the sprawling valley below. As the group of executives checked in, Emma couldn't help but notice how Adrian's gaze followed her every movement. Was she imagining it? Or was there something deeper behind his polite professionalism? Later that evening, the group gathered for a welcome dinner in the grand dining room. It was a glittering affair, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the lavish spread. Emma found herself seated next to Adrian, their knees occasionally brushing under the table. Every touch sent a shiver down her spine, though she remained poised, engaging in conversations about sales figures and market strategies, all while the heat between them smoldered. Midway through the meal, Emma excused herself to step outside for a moment of fresh air. The cool night breeze kissed her skin as she stood on the balcony, overlooking the illuminated valley. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. When she opened them, Adrian was standing beside her, his presence so close she could feel the warmth radiating off him. "You've been quiet tonight," he said softly, his voice low and intimate, unlike the crisp tone he used in meetings. Emma's pulse quickened. "Just taking it all in," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian leaned on the balcony, his hand brushing against hers. Neither of them moved it away. The silence between them grew thick, charged. Emma's mind raced. This was dangerous, forbidden. She was a married woman. Yet the magnetic pull toward him was stronger than any rational thought. "You've done impressive work this year," Adrian murmured, his gaze flickering from the view to her lips. "I have no doubt your future here is bright." Emma's breath hitched, caught between the thrill of his compliment and the dark desire creeping up her spine. She knew what he was really saying. It wasn't about work. It was about them. Suddenly, the door to the balcony creaked open, and a few colleagues stepped outside, laughing and chatting. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding. Adrian straightened, the moment shattered. But as they returned to the group inside, the unspoken promise hung between them, crackling with anticipation. Part 2. The first step. The second day of the retreat was packed with meetings and presentations, but Emma found it hard to focus. her thoughts kept drifting back to the moment on the balcony with Adrian. The way his voice had dropped when he spoke to her, the way their hands had barely touched but sent jolts of electricity up her arm, it was all she could think about. As she sat in the large conference room with her fellow executives, Emma found herself stealing glances at Adrian. He was at the head of the table, leading the discussion with his usual confidence, but every now and then his eyes would flick toward her, lingering just a little too long. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks each time, a warmth that spread through her entire body. Halfway through a colleague's presentation, she felt her phone buzz in her lap. A message from Mark. "How's the retreat going? You must be killing it." She stared at the screen for a moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. "It's going great," she finally typed back, the lie slipping through her fingers with ease. She felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the excitement coursing through her veins. Lunch was served in the hotel's restaurant, a stunning space with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the natural beauty of the surrounding mountains. Emma sat down with a few colleagues, engaging in small talk, but her focus was elsewhere. She could see Adrian across the room, his attention split between the people around him and her, always her. When lunch wrapped up, she returned to her room for a quick break before the afternoon sessions began. She opened the door to her suite, taking in the sleek modern decor, the plush bed, and the panoramic view of the snow-capped peaks outside. As she set her laptop down, there was a knock on the door. Her heart skipped a beat. She walked to the door, hands trembling as she reached for the handle. When she opened it, Adrian stood there, his gaze intense, his presence filling the doorway. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his voice steady but low. Emma swallowed, stepping aside to let him in. As the door clicked shut behind him, the air in the room seemed to shift, thickening with a tension that was impossible to ignore. She turned to face him, but before she could say anything, he closed the distance between them, his hand gently cupping her face. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, but there was no hesitation in his touch. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him, her body betraying every rational thought. The tension that had been building for weeks finally broke, and she leaned into him, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both soft and hungry. It was as though the world outside the room ceased to exist. Adrian's hands slid down her back, pulling her closer, and she could feel the heat of him through his suit. She pressed against him, her mind spinning. This was wrong, so wrong, but it felt so exhilarating, so real. The walls of professionalism they had carefully constructed between them crumbled in an instant, leaving nothing but raw desire in their place. He pulled back for a moment, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing heavily. "We should stop," he said, though his hands betrayed him, still lingering on her waist, fingers brushing the soft fabric of her blouse. But neither of them moved. The sound of voices in the hallway outside brought them back to reality, and Adrian stepped away, clearing his throat. Emma turned, catching her reflection in the mirror on the wall. Her lipstick slightly smudged, her cheeks flushed. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to straighten her clothes, smoothing her hair as though nothing had happened. "We'll be late for the next session," Adrian said, his voice back to its usual composed tone. But the way he looked at her, the heat in his eyes, the unspoken promise of more, said everything that words couldn't. Emma nodded, her mind still reeling. They left the room separately, careful not to attract attention. But as they walked back toward the conference room, Emma's phone buzzed again. Another message from Mark. "Any exciting news from today?" She stared at the screen, her fingers frozen. The guilt that had been a faint whisper in the back of her mind was now a roar, but it was drowned out by the thrill of what had just happened. What was happening? Later that night, as she lay in her hotel bed, staring up at the ceiling, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Part 3. The Spiral. The retreat pressed on, a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and team-building exercises. But for Emma, everything was tinted with the memory of Adrian's touch, his kiss, the weight of his body against hers. Every glance they exchanged across the room carried a secret promise, a dangerous allure that was becoming harder and harder to resist. That evening, the team gathered in the hotel bar for drinks. The atmosphere was relaxed, the tension of the day giving way to laughter and casual conversation. Emma sat with her colleagues, sipping a glass of wine, but her attention was elsewhere. Adrian was seated at the far end of the bar, talking with a few senior executives, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. The wine warmed her, loosening the tight knot of guilt in her chest, and soon the laughter around her felt distant, drowned out by the pulse of desire that beat in time with every stolen look from Adrian. When she excused herself to go to the restroom, her heart skipped as she noticed Adrian subtly follow her out of the bar. In the quiet hallway just outside, she felt his presence behind her before she even turned around. The dim lighting cast long shadows on the walls, and her pulse quickened as she faced him. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low, his body close enough that she could smell the faint scent of his cologne. It was intoxicating. Emma's breath hitched. "Adrian, we can't," she started, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she even believed them anymore. Before she could say anything more, he stepped forward, closing the small distance between them. His hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her into a kiss that was hungrier than the last. This time, there was no hesitation, no half-hearted restraint. Emma felt her body melt into his, her hands grasping at his suit jacket, as they stumbled into a dark corner of the hallway, hidden from view. Every kiss, every touch sent a rush of adrenaline through her, mixing with the guilt and excitement in equal measure. This was dangerous. This was madness. But she didn't want to stop. His hand slid up her thigh, lifting her skirt just enough to make her gasp. The sensation of his fingers against her bare skin sent a shiver down her spine, and she pressed closer to him, craving more. Her mind was a whirlwind of desire and panic. What if someone saw? What if this went too far? But the risk only seemed to make it more intoxicating. "Emma," he whispered against her lips, his voice rough with need. "I want you." Her breath hitched again, and for a moment, time stood still. She wanted to pull away, to think about the consequences, about Mark, about her career. But then Adrian's hands tightened on her hips and her resolve crumbled completely. Just as their kiss deepened, a sound in the hallway startled them both. Footsteps. Laughter. Someone was coming. Adrian pulled back, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his eyes dark with desire. Emma stepped back too, her heart pounding in her ears. She quickly adjusted her skirt, smoothing her hair as she tried to regain her composure. They exchanged a brief, breathless look before slipping back into the bar separately, both of them careful to act as though nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Emma barely spoke, her thoughts spinning with guilt and excitement, the heat of Adrian's touch still lingering on her skin. She caught him looking at her once or twice from across the room, but neither of them made a move. Not in front of everyone. Later, when she finally returned to her room, she collapsed on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had never done anything like this before. Mark had always been her rock, her stability. They had built a life together, and though the passion between them had faded in recent years, they were still a team. But now there was this. Adrian. The thrill of something new, something forbidden, had awakened something inside her that she hadn't felt in years. But it also filled her with a crushing sense of guilt. What was she doing? Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Another message from Mark. "Miss you, can't wait for you to come home." Emma stared at the screen, her stomach twisting with guilt. She couldn't bring herself to reply. Not yet. She tossed the phone aside, running her hands through her hair, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. But the guilt didn't go away. Neither did the desire. The next morning, the group gathered for the final day of the retreat. It was a high-stakes day, important presentations, key decisions, and discussions about the company's future. Emma was supposed to be focused, professional, but every time Adrian looked at her, she felt that same pull, that same magnetic attraction that was impossible to ignore. As the day wore on, the tension between them only grew. By the time the final session ended, Emma felt like she was walking on a knife's edge. One wrong step, and everything would come crashing down. That evening, after the official events had ended, she received a message from Adrian. "Meet me in the lounge, we need to talk." Her heart raced as she read the message. She knew what it meant. She knew where this was headed. And she wasn't sure if she could stop it. Part 4. Caught in the moment. Emma stood in front of the mirror in her hotel room, staring at her reflection. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her blouse and checked her appearance for the third time. She looked flawless, every detail perfect, but inside she was a mess. Adrian's message had been brief, but she knew what it meant. She knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation in the lounge. The voice of reason in her mind screamed at her to stop, to take a step back and remember who she was, what she had to lose. But the rush of excitement, the thrill of the forbidden, drowned out every sensible thought. She wanted him. She wanted the danger. With a deep breath, she grabbed her phone and headed down to the lounge. The luxury of the hotel felt more suffocating tonight, the polished floors and soft lighting making her feel even more exposed, more aware of the risks she was about to take. The hallways were mostly empty, save for a few executives lingering by the bar, their voices low, their laughter muted. As she approached the lounge, she spotted Adrian sitting in a corner booth, away from the main crowd. His tie was loosened, his posture relaxed, but the moment his eyes met hers, there was no mistaking the intensity between them. The air felt electric, charged with all the unspoken words and desires that had been building between them for days. Emma walked over, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment, and slid into the booth opposite him. Neither of them spoke at first. Adrian took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving hers, and the silence between them was thick with anticipation. "I couldn't stop thinking about last night," Adrian finally said, his voice low, intimate. "I haven't been able to think about anything else." Emma's throat felt tight. "Adrian, this is dangerous," she whispered. Though her voice betrayed her, she wasn't trying to stop him. She didn't want to stop. Adrian leaned forward, his hand reaching out to cover hers on the table. His touch sent a wave of heat through her. "I know," he said softly. "But I don't care. I want you." The words hung between them, and Emma felt her resolve weaken. Her mind flashed to Mark, his texts, his trust, his love. But here she was, sitting across from a man who made her feel alive in ways she hadn't in years. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, but the pull toward Adrian was too strong to resist. Without thinking, she stood up. "Let's go somewhere more private," she murmured, barely recognizing her own voice. Adrian's eyes darkened with desire, and he stood up too, following her without question. They left the lounge together, moving swiftly through the hallways until they reached her suite. The moment the door closed behind them, the tension snapped, and they were on each other. Adrian's hands were in her hair, pulling her close as his lips claimed hers with an urgency that made Emma's head spin. She clung to him, her body pressed against his as they stumbled toward the bed. The room was dimly lit, shadows dancing on the walls as they moved together in a frenzy of passion, all pretense of control lost. Every touch, every kiss was electric, and Emma felt like she was spiraling into something she couldn't control. She didn't care. The consequences felt distant, unreal, as Adrian's hands explored her body, peeling away the layers of her clothes with deliberate slowness, heightening the tension with every second. Their bodies pressed together, hot and wanting, and for a moment, all thoughts of the outside world, of her marriage, vanished. She was lost in the moment, in the thrill of being desired so completely. Adrian's lips trailed down her neck, his hands sliding over her bare skin, and Emma's breath came in shallow gasps. She had never felt anything like this, so intense, so overwhelming. And then, just as they were about to give in to the heat of the moment, the room was suddenly filled with the shrill sound of her phone ringing. The sound cut through the haze of desire like a knife, and Emma froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She reached for the phone on the nightstand, her mind already racing with dread. She glanced at the screen, and her stomach dropped. It was Mark. Adrian pulled back slightly, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and concern as she stared at the phone, her hands shaking. She couldn't answer it. Not now. Not like this. But the phone kept ringing. Her mind whirled with panic, guilt crashing over her in waves. She had crossed the line, crossed it so far that she didn't know how to get back. And now, with Mark's name flashing on her screen, she realized just how close everything was to falling apart. She silenced the call, but the damage was done. The weight of what she was doing hit her all at once, and she felt like she couldn't breathe. Adrian reached out to touch her, but Emma stepped away, wrapping her arms around herself as if that could shield her from the crushing reality of the situation. I can't, she whispered, her voice trembling. I have to stop this. Adrian looked at her, his expression softening as he reached out to her. Emma. But she shook her head, her thoughts a tangled mess. She didn't know what to do, what to say. All she knew was that her life was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't control, and for the first time since this started, she was scared of what might come next. Part 5. The Edge of Collapse. The silence in the room was suffocating. Emma stood frozen by the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around her body, the glow from her silenced phone still illuminating the screen. Mark's name lingered there, a reminder of everything she was putting at risk, everything that was about to unravel. Adrian watched her from across the room, the hunger in his eyes tempered now by something else. Concern, perhaps even regret. The heat between them had dissipated in an instant, replaced by the cold reality of what they had almost done. What they were doing. Emma, he began softly, his voice gentle, as though he was afraid that one wrong word might shatter the fragile moment. You don't have to answer it. We don't have to do this if you're not ready. His words, meant to comfort, only made the guilt tighten like a noose around her neck. How had she let things spiral this far out of control? She wasn't this person, the kind who cheated, who risked her marriage, her career, for a fleeting moment of passion. And yet, here she was, standing in a hotel room with her boss, her husband calling from hundreds of miles away, unaware of the storm brewing in her heart. She felt trapped, torn between two lives, two versions of herself. There was the Emma who had built a life with Mark, a life of stability, trust, and love. And then there was the Emma standing here now, drawn to the dangerous allure of Adrian, to the way he made her feel alive, desired, in a way she hadn't felt in years. The weight of it all was crushing her. I can't, Emma whispered, her voice breaking. She backed away from Adrian, needing space, needing to think, but the walls of the hotel room seemed to close in around her. She couldn't escape the consequences, couldn't undo what had already been set into motion. Adrian stepped closer, his expression soft, but there was still that glint of desire in his eyes. I know this is complicated. I know you're feeling torn, but Emma, you don't have to choose right now. We can take things slow, figure this out. But that was the problem. There was no figuring this out. She had crossed a line with Adrian, and even if they hadn't gone all the way, the damage was already done. How could she face Mark now? How could she look him in the eye and pretend like everything was fine? Her phone buzzed again, startling her out of her thoughts. Another call. This time, she couldn't ignore it. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and pressed it to her ear, her voice barely above a whisper as she answered. Hey. Mark's voice on the other end was warm, familiar. Hey babe. How's it going? I've been trying to reach you. Everything okay?" Emma's throat tightened, the guilt rising like bile. She could hear the concern in his voice, and it crushed her. She glanced at Adrian, who stood still, watching her intently, as if waiting for her next move. "Yeah," she managed, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry, I got caught up in the final session. It's been busy." She hated the lies slipping from her lips, but what else could she say? "That's all right. I just wanted to check in." "I know these trips can be exhausting," Mark said, oblivious to the turmoil on her end. "I miss you. Can't wait for you to come home." Emma's heart shattered at those words. He trusted her completely. She could hear it in every syllable. And yet here she was, hiding the truth, balancing on the edge of infidelity with a man she barely knew outside of work. "I miss you too," she whispered, her eyes flicking to Adrian, who now leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the unspoken tension still thick between them. Mark continued talking, asking her about the retreat, the meetings, if anything exciting had happened. Emma answered on autopilot, her responses short, her mind a tangled mess of guilt and confusion. She could barely hear his words over the sound of her own heart pounding in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, Mark finally said, "All right. I'll let you go. Get some rest, okay? I love you." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "I love you too," she said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. She hung up the phone, staring at the screen for a long moment, the silence in the room becoming unbearable. When she looked up, Adrian was watching her with an unreadable expression. The tension between them was still there, but it had shifted. No longer the electric, undeniable pull of desire, but something more complicated. More dangerous. "Emma," he said quietly, stepping forward. "You don't have to decide anything right now." But she shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I've already made a decision, Adrian. I let this happen. I let us happen." He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her otherwise. He just stood there, watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Emma wiped at her eyes, her mind spinning with too many emotions to process. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of walking away, of leaving this behind, was harder than she had expected. There was a part of her that craved the excitement, the thrill that Adrian had brought into her life. But there was also a part of her that was terrified of losing everything she had built with Mark. "I need time," she whispered, her voice shaky. Adrian nodded slowly, understanding. "I'll give you that." Without another word, Emma grabbed her coat and her purse and walked to the door. She didn't look back as she left the room, her mind still buzzing with everything that had happened. As she stepped into the quiet hallway, the weight of her choices pressed down on her. Outside, the cold night air hit her like a slap, clearing her head just enough to let the guilt settle deep in her chest. She had crossed a line tonight, and she wasn't sure if she could ever go back. But for now, she needed space, time to figure out what came next. Her phone buzzed again as she walked toward the hotel lobby, and she glanced down at it, half expecting it to be Adrian or Mark. But it was a message from a colleague, sharing a photo from the retreat, a candid group shot from earlier that day. Emma's heart stopped when she saw it. In the background, barely noticeable, was her and Adrian, standing just a little too close. His hand resting on her lower back, her body angled toward his, their connection undeniable. Her stomach lurched as she realized the implications. This wasn't just between them anymore. Someone had seen. And now, the spiral she had feared was already beginning. As she stepped outside, the cold air stinging her cheeks, Emma felt the world closing in around her. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. What would you do if your work and personal life collided in a dangerous way? Share your thoughts on how this story should end in the comments.